All right, welcome back, Lab 7. We're going to be looking at today. Lab 7 covers the skeletal system. Looking at the objectives, we will first, I'd look at the bones of the human body and identify the names of the bones. So we'll start with some anatomy. We'll take a look at the long bones. Specifically, the kinds of things that we can find inside the long bones. A long bone would be something like the femur or the radius, tibia, something like that. And then we were going to look at the structural units inside the bones of compact bone. Those structural units are called Haversian systems or osteons. They call them both. So we'll look at both of these. Now today I don't have my stylus that I normally have for writing on the document, so I only have my mouse. So I'm kind of going to be confined to using my mouse to write or to use this text box feature, which I can't stand, but whatever, we'll get through it. All right, so to start, there's 206 bones in the body. This is on the lab book, page 85. We can divide the skeletal system into two main sections. The first section being the axial skeleton, and that's going to include everything that goes right down the middle, starting with the skull, and then the vertebral column, right, the collection of bones that goes right down the middle, including the rib cage and the sternum. And we have functions of those things right in here as well. Everything outside of that, everything lateral to that, would be the appendicular skeleton. So this is going to include your limbs, your upper limbs, and your lower limbs. The upper limbs attach to the body through a collection of bones known as the pectoral girdle. And the pectoral girdle would be up here in your shoulders, because that's where the arms attach. And it's in the pectoral girdle that we find two bones. We have the clavicle, which is your collarbone, and the scapula, which is your shoulder blade. Sometimes if you reach around back there, you could kind of feel it with your thumb poking out. The pelvic girdle attaches the lower limbs to the body, and it's a collection of bones making up the pelvis. And I'll show you this as when we get to it. So here's an extensive list of all the bones that we find when we really look deeper into both divisions of the skeleton. If we look closer at the axial skeleton, it's not just the skull, right? It's not just one cranium. The skull is made up of many bones. All right. It looks like one bone, right? But it's not. There's many bones, and it just so happens that these bones are fused together. But we can, divide the skull or the cranium into several different bones, and you can see just the list here: frontal bones, parietal bones, temporal bones, occipital bones. Now, what's interesting about these first four is that they are named after, right? The temporal bones are on the sides here. They're named after the lobes of the brain that they cover. So the temporal bones cover the temporal lobes. The occipital bones in the back cover the occipital lobes. The parietal bones up here on the top cover the parietal lobes, and the frontal bones cover the frontal lobe. So we'll take a look at those, but then we have some other ones as well, including sphenoid bones, ethmoid bones, zygomatic bones. These are your cheekbones, the nasal bones up here. The hyoid bone is an interesting bone. It's the only bone in the body that doesn't articulate with another bone. It's just kind of free floating out there all by itself. We'll look at that. We'll look at some joints where immovable joints meet, like the bones in the skull. They don't allow for any movement, and those areas are referred to as sutures. I'll show you what those look like. And if we just look over here on the other side, the appendicular skeleton, this is the limbs and the girdles The pectoral girdle, I told you, is made up of the scapula and clavicle, and these are all the bones that make up the upper limbs, so the arms, including the humerus, the radius and ulna, the carpals in the wrists, and all these bones in the hands and fingers. If we go down to the pelvic girdle and look at the lower limbs, we're going to be looking at the bones that make up the pelvic bone, all right, including the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. And it's these bones that make up the pelvic girdle. And then, of course, we'll look at the actual bones of the lower limbs. Starting with the big femur, which is the largest bone in the body, and then the patella, the lower bones, and the bones of the lower leg, the ankles, the feet, and the toes. Okay, so again, this is how they're dividing the skeleton into two major categories: axial, everything down the middle, the skull, the sternum, the rib cage, and the vertebral column. Everything else shooting from the outside would be appendicular. All right, so the axial skeleton is medial to the appendicular skeleton. The appendicular skeleton is lateral to the axial skeleton, because the appendicular skeleton includes the appendages, and the appendages are to the sides, right? This is a fetal skull. A couple features here include the fontanelles, and you can see the fontanelles. It would be we would commonly refer to these areas in the skull as being soft spots. You notice that when a baby is born, there's a soft spot on the top of their head, and there's another one in the back of their head. And that's where these bones haven't quite fused together. But as the baby grows, the bones will grow, and eventually these bones will fuse together, forming sutures that are tight, immovable joints. Looking at the skull, this diagram is labeled nicely. Here we have a view looking at the front of the skull, and clearly we can see the frontal lobes. And then we also see inside the eye sockets the sphenoid bone, the nasal bone, and the cheekbones at the zygomatic bones. There's two jaw bones. The upper bone is the maxilla, and the lower jawbone is the mandible. If we were to take the top of the skull off, this is called a transverse section. When we do this, we take a transverse section, we take a straight line and go right across the top, and we could take the top off and look down into. So what we're doing is we're having an inferior view through the transverse section. And what do we see inside here? Well, we could see the frontal lobes again. The ethmoid bone is in here, the sphenoid bones, and then the temporal bones on the sides, and the occipital bones in the back. So over here, we don't see the temporal bones. Well, we can kind of see them, but they're not labeled. And we certainly can't see the occipital bone because it would be all the way in the back side. Now, there in here would be the brain, right? So the brain would be taking up most of the real estate in here. And attached to the brain is a spinal cord. And the spinal cord has to leave the skull. And that's what this hole is for, the foramen magnum. All right, so this is an exit point for the spinal cord, the foramen magnum. And we have a side view of the parietal bones. These are the bones that are on the top, protecting the parietal lobes, frontal bones, temporal bones, occipital bones. Again, it's these four that are named after the lobes that they protect. All right. The ethmoid bones are in here, the sphenoid bones, nasal bones, zygomatic bones are your cheekbones, and then the two bones of the jaw, upper jaw, the maxilla, and the lower jaw mandible. This would be a hinge joint, by the way. This is a top view. We could divide the vertebral column. Remember, the vertebral column is a collection of bone that protects the spinal cord. The brain is in here. The skull protects the brain, but the spinal cord is very delicate nervous tissue, and it is protected by these bones here. So the first set of bones are found in the neck area, and there's 7 of them, and these are called the cervical vertebrae. After that, we have a set of 12 that kind of go along with the rib cage. These 12 are called the thoracic vertebrae. And then we have the vertebrae of the lower back. These are called the lumbar vertebrae, and they articulate with the sacrum. The sacrum is a collection of 5 vertebrae. It looks like one big one, but it's actually 5 separate vertebrae that have fused together, creating a sacrum. And then our tailbones are present as well in the form of the coccyx. The tailbones are not really part of the vertebral column because the spinal cord doesn't go down that far. In fact, the spinal cord goes all the way through the cervical vertebrae, through the thoracic vertebrae, lumbar vertebrae. We do have 5 of those, and the spinal cord will go about halfway through the lumbar, but then we have more nerves that extend even further. This is a side view of the rib cage. Okay, so we have the ribs here, you could clearly see, and then the ribs attach, or the ribs articulate with the sternum through what is called costal cartilage. All right, so there's cartilage that connects to the sternum in between the ribs. Not all ribs attach to the sternum. Over here, we have 2 pairs of ribs that don't attach to the sternum. These are called floating ribs. Some ribs don't attach or articulate directly with the sternum. They articulate indirectly with the sternum. And that's ribs like these, where the cartilage kind of piggybacks off of the cartilage of another pair before it articulates with the cartilage. And those are called false ribs. This is a practice diagram for when you're quizzing yourself. You can label this diagram. I'm going to show you, if you look in the lab atlas, that this diagram should be completely. Oh, maybe it's not. And if it's not, then we'll do it together. How about that? What do you say? I thought it was in there. Let's do it. Let's change the font size here. Nope, too big. All right. Why don't we do the axial skeleton first? This, of course, is going to be the sternum. And then we have the ribs, followed by that's not the ribs, excuse me. This is pointing to the costal cartilage. And this is costal cartilage, and then this is going to be the ribs down here. All right, that matches up pretty good. If we go down further, the appendicular skeleton, specifically of the lower limbs, we have, let's make this a little bigger. We have the femur. The femur is this bone here. And here we have the kneecap, but we would call that the patella. In the lower leg, we have 2 bones. We have a larger bone and then a smaller bone, a thinner bone. The larger bone is called the tibia. And the thinner one, the smaller one, is called the fibula. A lot of students make the mistake, and sometimes they get confused between the two, and they'll call one the fibia, and the other one, the tibula. Well, that would have to be marked incorrect because that's not the case, right? It's a tibia and a fibula. All right. So just make sure that we are aware of that. The little bone in the leg, the smaller of the two, if you tell a little lie, right, that would be telling a fib, right? So therefore, that just if you kind of remember that, a little lie is a fib, the little bone is a fibula. In the ankles, we have tarsals, and in the feet, we have metatarsals. Which are the toes. And in the lab atlas, we'll take a closer look at those. Up here in the appendicular skeleton of the upper limb, we have the pectoral girdle, and that includes the clavicle and the scapula. Here we have the humerus. And it looks like they are giving us some clues here because this is kind of hard to tell. Why is it hard to tell? Well, first of all, this model is not in the anatomical position because his hands are down at the sides and the palms are not in a supinator position. If the palms are in a supinator position, we would clearly see that the bones that are on the outside, that are on the lateral side, that follow the thumb, would be the radius. But we can't really tell from this angle. So that's why they're giving us a clue. So we're going to put radius here. And these ones that follow the pinky, now this is only when the palms are in the upward position, right? Like this. Supinator. Supinate. Give me a bowl of soup, right? Like this. So when they're like that, you can see better the arrangement of these two bones. When the palms are in a pronate position, when the palms are down, these two bones crisscross like this, and then it's just harder to differentiate between the two of them. But if you always remember that following the thumb, like if you notice, you could move your thumb in a circle, right? So if you move your thumb in a circle, you could also say that it moves radially. So just kind of remember, put that in the hat, moving your thumb radially with the bone that is on the thumb side being called the radius. In the wrist, you have carpals, and then in the hand we have metacarpals, and then we have phalanges again. The fingers. All right, so this is a good look at the pelvic girdle. On the right side, which is your left side, it shows us the three bones of the pelvis, right? This is the pelvic bone, but the pelvic bone could be divided into three parts. There's the os coxae, which is the whole thing collectively, but the meat of the os coxae is called the ilium. But there's also this pubis bone and the ischium as well. All right, and here we see the lumbar vertebrae coming down, and we can see better where the lumbar vertebrae articulate with the sacrum. Remember, the sacrum is all fused. That's 5 vertebrae fused together, so it looks like one big piece. And this would be the femur, the ball joint of the femur. Now, there's a way to tell the difference between males and females by looking at the pelvis. For one, there is a angle difference when it comes to the pubis bones. In the male, this angle is 90 degrees or less. Well, compared to the female, the pubis bone over here, you can see this angle is much greater. It would be 100 degrees or more. Okay, so if you're looking at pelvis and this pubis bone, this is the easiest way to tell. Um, Also, this pelvic outlet, this space in here is larger in a female compared to the male. And that makes sense because females are the ones that have to give birth, right? Have to perform childbirth. All right, so this is going to be a little bit of research that I would like you to work on your own. So you'll use the interwebs and the Googles to help you. Well, most of these are kind of common sense, but the ones you get stuck on, you could certainly look up. And what are we doing? Well, you're just answering the questions, really. For example, which cervical vertebra is responsible for nodding your head yes? All right. Well, there's 7 cervical vertebra. Nodding your head yes is going to be um, a collection of them, really. But what's interesting about the cervical vertebra is that they decided to give names to the first 2. Really, all the vertebra are numbered, right? The cervical vertebrae are the first 7 in the neck, and we would refer to those as C1 through C7, right? However, the first one was it's named. They gave it a name. It's called Atlas. And Atlas, as some of you might know, is a fictional character of, I'm guessing, Greek mythology. He's the character that holds the planet up on his head, right? So that name does make sense because this is the vertebrae that articulates with the skull. Okay, so the world being the brain. So this is the one that's coming in contact with the skull. The second one, C2, also has a name. It's called the axis. But the rest of them are just numbered C3 through C7. And then the thoracic vertebrae, the thoracic ones, the next ones, there's 12 of them. They're just numbered T1 through T12, the lumbar L1 through L12. All right. Compare the shoulder joint to the hip joint. Explain which is more stable. Yeah, well, I mean, the shoulder joint and the hip joint, they're both ball and socket joints. However, the shoulder joint has more movement so allowed to it. You could move your shoulder in a greater circle than you can your hip. The hip joint would be much more stable and least likely to become dislocated because there's a lot more muscle there because you're walking that joint supports a lot more weight all the time, so it's a much stronger joint. There's a lot more muscle there. All right, so look at these, answer these the best that you can. This is going to be some work for you to do independently, but it's not very difficult. You're not going to have a hard time with it. All right, looking inside the long bones, this is if we slice the long bone open and now we're looking inside of it. What do we see? Well, at the end of long bones, we see articulating cartilage. And this is there to protect the ends of the bones because remember, in the joints, the bones are rubbing together. We don't want the bones to wear away. So this articular cartilage is there for that reason. This is called an epiphyseal plate. It's also known as a growth plate. And if this is a young bone or an adolescent bone, this growth plate will appear as soft cartilage because this is the site that the bone is actively growing. So as bones grow, they become longer, right? And they become longer because this is the active growth site. As we add more bone here and only here or here at the other end, the bones become longer. So that's the growth plate. When we reach the end of growing. So when we are about 18 to 20 years old, we're not growing anymore. This growth plate will eventually convert from cartilage to bone. So if you see a bone in the woods and you want to slice it open, and if this is still soft cartilage, you'll know that that bone came from a young animal. But if you notice that it's hard and calcified, you'll notice that you will come to the conclusion that that bone came from an adult animal. There's two types of marrow inside the bones. At the ends of the bones, by the way, are called the epiphysis. The epiphysis. E for epiphysis, E for end. Remember that. It's in the epiphysis that we see red bone marrow. There's also a great concentration of spongy bone in here. Spongy bone is more of a porous bone compared to the shaft of the bone. The shaft of the bone is called the diaphysis, and the walls of the shaft is not very porous. The walls of this shaft is made up of what's called compact bone. It's a very dense bone. When we look at the functional units of the bone, we're going to be looking at the osteons or Haversian systems of compact bone. And when we get into this in lecture, we're going to take a much more detailed look at these things. But anyway, there's red bone marrows in the ends, in the epiphysis, and it's the red bone marrow that makes blood cells, right? So this is where red blood cells are coming, white blood cells are coming, platelets are coming from here. In the yellow bone marrow, this is an area for storage of lipids. We store fats in our bones, in the shaft of our bones, or in the diaphysis. This is called this empty space that's filled with yellow marrow. This is called the medullary cavity. Let's label that. It's kind of important. Medullary cavity. All right, I think that's about it. We got some functions here. The diaphysis is the shaft. The epiphysis are the ends. Oh, there it is, the medullary cavity. Articular cartilage. This covers the ends of the bones. Red marrow. And spongy bone. That's what we find in the epiphysis. Compact bone is the dense bone found along the edges. The growth plate is also called the epiphyseal plate. Again, it's made of cartilage. It allows for growth. When the animal's grown, it disappears and it gets replaced by bone. The periosteum. Periosteum. Well, peri means outside, right? Like if you were to measure the perimeter of your yard, you'd measure the outside distance of the outside. Peri means outside. Anything osteo means bone. So when we see periosteum, that word means outside of the bone. Well, outside of the bone, there's a very thin tissue covering the bone. It's called the periosteum. It's not really labeled here, though, is it? If you were to go to the butcher shop and ask for a bone, like a pig bone, well, you would be able to take that bone and with your fingernail, you'd be able to peel this outer layer off. And it comes off, not very easily, but you could separate it from the bone for sure. That would be the periosteum. And the periosteum is packed with specialized cells called osteoblasts and osteocytes. And what they do is they either build bone or dissolve bone, but they're very, very important. There's a couple different types of bone building, like when we look in the bones. One type of bone is called intramembranous ossification, and this is happening in the periosteum. All right, so can we tell if this bone is from an adult or a young animal looking at this one? Yeah, of course we can tell. How could you tell? Well, you would, with your finger, you would touch this epiphyseal plate here. And if it is hard, like the rest of the bone, then you would come to the conclusion that this is an adult animal. If it's soft, like cartilage, like the cartilage in your nose and in your ears, well, then you would come to the conclusion that this is a young animal. All right, so let's see if we could label these things here. This is the growth plate, the epiphyseal plate. It's in the epiphysis that we see red bone marrow. That's where red bone marrow would be. Here we see some cartilage on the outside protecting the bones. This is called articular cartilage. Over here, we see compact bone, the dense compact bone. And over here, we have the medullary cavity. Inside the medullary cavity, we would have yellow marrow. We should say where we wrote red bone marrow, we should say that this is spongy bone with red bone marrow. So there's spongy bone with red bone marrow would be found down out here in the epiphysis at the ends of the bone. All right, that looks pretty good. And then we have these questions here, right? What fills the spaces of the spongy bone? Well, we wrote it already. Red bone marrow fills those spaces. What fills the medullary cavity? Yellow bone marrow, those lipids. What is the chemical nature of yellow bone marrow? Well, we know it's lipids. How do we know? Because I just said it. How could we tell? We didn't do lab number 2, however, because it's a remote class, and that was the one lab that we had to skip. But there is a test for lipids that you can do. And the way you can tell if a food item has lipids in it or fats in it is you could blot it against a brown paper bag. And if it leaves a translucent stain behind, then that's an indicator that there's lipids in that food item. So the paper bag test. That involves the translucent stain. Paper bag test. Yeah. A translucent stain is not a transparent stain. Like glass is transparent, right? A translucent stain would be a stain that once you hold it up to the light, it allows the light to pass through, right? So if that happens, then that's an indicator that there's lipids in that test. All right, so let's look at the functional units here, and let's go to the lab atlas for that. Let's review all this stuff here, though. All right, so again, the axial skeleton, everything right down the middle, the skull, the rib cage, vertebral column. Appendicular skeleton includes the girdles and the limbs. All right, again, just like the lab book, we have these bones labeled nicely. The first 4 that are labeled here protect the lobes of the brain that share the same names. And then we have the ethmoid and sphenoid bones. This is the inferior view, looking down with the top removed. Frontal, ethmoid, parietal, sphenoid, temporal, and in the back we have occipital, and then we see the foramen magnum here as well. Nasal bones, cheekbones, maxilla, mandible, and the hyoid bone we see back behind here. It looks like it's touching other bones in the model because they have to tie it to something in the model, but in real life it's not touching anything. It's floating out in space up around the larynx. The ribs, we got 12 pairs of ribs that connect to the sternum indirectly, because remember, there's costal cartilage. The first 7 articulate directly. We call those first 7 the true ribs. You could see the cartilage of the 7th one articulates directly to the sternum. But guess what? The cartilage of the 8th one does not. It piggybacks off of the 7th. And that is true for the 8th, 9th, and 10th one. So for that reason, we call the 8th, 9th, and 10th one false ribs. Their costal cartilage, doesn't articulate direct. And then we have two more in the back, floating ribs. They don't articulate with anything. Cervical vertebrae are in the neck. There's 7. C1 is called atlas. C2 is called axis. And then we have C3 through C7. Thoracic vertebrae, there's 12. T1 through T12. And then lumbar, L1 through L5. The 5 fused vertebrae of the sacrum, and then the coxal bones. Just remember, this is how I remember it. Breakfast is at 7, lunch is at 12, dinner's at 5. I know it's a little early for dinner, but just pretend you're having dinner at your grandparents'. In the pectoral girdle, we have 2 bones. We have the collarbone up here, but we don't put collarbone on the test because it's actually the clavicle. We don't put shoulder blade on the test. Back there, we put scapula. They make up the pectoral girdle. That's the back view. Posterior view, we should say, right? And then in the upper limbs, we start with the humerus. It's not very humorous when you hit your elbow. In fact, that's why they call it the funny bone. Here we see the palm is in the supinate position, and we could clearly see that the radius follows the thumb. There's the ulna. We have carpals in the wrist, metacarpals in the hand, 5 of them, and the phalanges. Now let's look at the phalanges closer. We have proximal, distal, and then you would think medial, but they're called middle. All right, proximal and distal. Now, these are terms that we use on the limbs. If something is closer to the site of attachment, where does the limb attach? It attaches up at the shoulder, right? These bones are closer to the site of attachment. That's why we call these proximal. If it's further from the site of attachment, we refer to those things as being distal. So these are just very basic directional terms. We've gone over these before, actually. They're not only used to describe the phalanges. We use these terms to describe anything, right? We could say the carpals are proximal to the metacarpals, right? We could say the metacarpals are distal to the carpals. What does that mean? That just means the metacarpals are further away from the attachment point. But the phalanges actually use these directional terms in their names, right? If you notice, the thumb only has a proximal and distal. It doesn't have the middle bones. So for that reason, with 3 being in every finger and 2 only being in the thumb, we have 14 total phalanges, 14 total. In the pelvic girdle, there we got the vertebrae coming down, the sacrum coming down. The os coxa consists of 3 bones. We really refer to this as the pelvic bone, right? The pelvic bone is called this big meaty part up here. You might refer to this as your hip bone, is the ilium, and then the pubis, and then underneath we have the ischium, all right? So these 3 bones make up the pelvis. What articulates with the pelvis? Well, this big bone, this is the largest bone in the body. That's the femur. And then we have a kneecap called the patella, a big bone and a little bone. The little bone, remember little lie is a fib, fibula. Big bone, tibia. That's the Shakespeare bone. Tibia or not tibia? That is the question. In the ankles, we have tarsals, and then in the feet, metatarsals and phalanges. The rules for the phalanges are the same in the feet as they are in the fingers. Proximal, distal, middle. Again, the big toe doesn't have the middle one, just like the thumb. So in the toes, we have 14 phalanges too, just like in the hand. Here's that long bone again. This is cut open. We're looking at the inside. I see a lot of stuff going on in here. Well, at the end, we would have the epiphysis, right? We see growth plates. These growth plates look like they've been converted to bone. We're looking at an adult bone here. At the ends, you would find articular cartilage that protects where the bones meet. Spongy bone is found on the ends in the epiphysis, and they would have red bone marrow. The diaphysis is the shaft. This is a hollow shaft. That opening is called the medullary cavity. It's that medullary cavity that would be filled with yellow bone marrow. Around the entire bone here, we have compact bone. This is dense, very dense compact bone right here. You can see the compact bone does even go into the epiphysis and around. But spongy bone is found primarily only in the epiphysis. So this is one osteon. Would be a model that we would have on our tables. This is one functional unit for bone called the osteon. You can see there's different layers here. These layers are called the lamella. This osteon has a couple different layers. If we start with in the center, this would have blood vessels and nerves. So this would supply nutrients and oxygen to the bone cells. But starting from the middle, if we were to count the layers, I would see one lamella, two lamella, three, four, five. So this system has about 5 rings associated. These are called concentric lamella. Not all the lamella are concentric lamella. Some of it are circumferential lamella, meaning that it kind of goes around the outside. But this is a nice model of a Haversian system or an osteon. It all starts with this, right? This is the blood supply. These cells along the outside are the bone producing cells, right? And these cells are a mature version of bone producing cells called osteocytes. These osteocytes get encased, right, in a little chamber. These chambers are called the lacuna, and the lacuna is a name that they use to describe. Actually, in Latin, it means little lake. Right, so it looks like a little lake. See, what happens is before this bone was formed, these osteocytes were in their immature form. They were called osteoblasts. And what happened is they started to secrete their bone producing secretions called osteoid, right? And what that does is over time it begins to calcify, it turns hard. And as it hardens, these cells become encased or entombed in their newly formed hardened matrix. So they have to like survive in these little chambers, and they stay in these chambers called the lacuna. So let's label some of these things. This whole thing right here is called an osteon, the whole network. If we look at these lacuna, they are connected to each other, and they all connect to the blood supply through these tiny little canals. These tiny canals are called the canaliculi. It's the osteocytes that live inside the lacuna. There's the lacuna. The lamella are the shapes, are the ring shapes that go around the outside, right? These ones. The central canal has an artery, nerves, and veins. Now that's a model view. If we look at the real view under the microscope, we could see, this is a high power view, by the way. This is one whole osteon. We could see the rings going around the lamella. There's one. There's one. There's one. There's our central canal. In there, we would have arteries, veins, and nerves. There's an osteocyte in a lacuna. There's another osteocyte in a lacuna. And you see the canaliculi, right? You see the canaliculi right there, extending from lacuna to lacuna all the way to the central canal. So even these cells all the way out here in the furthest lamella could still get nutrients and oxygen because the canaliculi connect, right? So nutrients and oxygen could leave this blood supply and feed these cells all the way out here. All right. Let's go back. So how could can we label this? What do we have to label? We have to label the lacuna, osteocyte, canaliculus, and lamella. Well, this is the lacuna with an osteocyte. This is a lacuna without an osteocyte. So let's label this one lacuna over here. Remember, lacuna is just an empty chamber. It means little lake. These are the rings of the lamella. This is our central cavity, consisting of our artery, vein, and nerves. And in here we have our osteocytes. Osteocyte. Osteo, bone, site, cell. These are bone producing cells. These cells aren't producing any bone anymore because this bone is already formed. So what is their job? Well, they're just going to be maintaining the matrix, right? They're maintaining the bone now. It's a mature version of the cells that once created this bone, which are called osteoblasts. All right, that's the end of the lab. So what I want you to do is use this lab atlas to make this microscopic observation of compact bone, specifically the osteon. So you're going to draw this ring system, this Haversian system, labeling the entire osteon, labeling the lamellae, the rings, the central canal, the canaliculi, and the lacuna with osteocytes. When that is done, in your notes section, what I want you to do is estimate the diameter of one osteon. Remember to fill these, and of course, your estimation is going to be in micrometers, right? Micrometers. This says low power view, but if we look here in the lab atlas, this is the view I would like you to use, and it looks like it's a high power view. So the objective lens is 40x, total magnification is 400x, and the field diameter is 450x. So that being said, well, what does that mean? You know what that means. That means that the distance across is 450 micrometers. Right? So using that field diameter on 400x magnification, after you draw the osteon to scale, you're going to estimate the diameter of that osteon using this. Okay, so you should know how to do that. We've done that before. Any questions? Email me. You also have this page I would like you to finish. All right, so a little bit of research for you. Okay, definitely want to know the names of the bones that we have listed here for the lab exam, for sure. Okay. That being said, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me. And yeah, I guess that's it. Okay. Next week, we look at muscular system. Bye.